The morning mist hung low over the Rocky Mountains as David stepped out of his wooden cabin. The air was crisp and clean, filling his lungs with the kind of freshness that only came from living miles away from any city. At 45 years old, David had learned to love this silence. His weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as he watched the sun slowly paint the mountain peaks golden. David's cabin sat on 20 acres of mountain land that he had bought 15 years ago with his late wife, Maria. Back then, they had dreams of building a family retreat, maybe even starting a small farm. Maria had loved the idea of growing their own vegetables and living simply. She would spend hours planning where to put the garden, where to build a chicken coop, and how to make the most beautiful flower beds. But life had other plans. 5 years ago, Maria was driving down the winding mountain road to town when a sudden storm hit. The roads became slippery and her car slid off the edge. David found out about the accident when the sheriff knocked on his door that evening. Since that day, he had been living alone, tending to the land they had once shared. The nearest town was 2 hours away by truck, down roads that twisted and turned like a snake. David only made the trip once a month to buy supplies he couldn't grow or make himself: sugar, flour, coffee, and a few other basics. The townspeople knew him as the quiet mountain man who kept to himself, but was always polite when he came to shop. Most days, David's routine was simple. He would wake up at sunrise, check on his small vegetable garden, and fix anything that needed repairs around the property. He had learned to be handy with tools over the years. When you live this far from town, you learn to fix things yourself or do without. His garden was his pride. Maria had started it, but David had kept it going all these years. Tomatoes, corn beans, and potatoes grew in neat rows. He had also learned to preserve food for winter, something Maria had been teaching him before she passed away. Jars of pickled vegetables and preserved fruits lined the shelves in his small pantry. David had built a workshop in what used to be planned as a second bedroom. Here he spent his evenings carving wood, fixing tools, and working on small projects. He had gotten good at making furniture and had even sold a few pieces to people in town. But mostly he made things because it kept his hands busy and his mind calm. The loneliness wasn't something David talked about, but it was always there. Sometimes when he was working in the garden, he would catch himself talking to Maria, as if she were still there. He would tell her about how the tomatoes were growing or ask her opinion about where to plant the new apple tree. The sound of his own voice in the quiet mountains reminded him how alone he really was. David had friends in town, but they lived different lives. They had families, jobs, and busy schedules. When they invited him to barbecues or birthday parties, David often felt like an outsider looking in. Children would run around playing while parents talked about school events and work problems. David would smile and nod, but inside he felt the gap between his quiet mountain life and their busy town lives. Winter was the hardest time. Snow would pile up for months, making the road down to town impossible to drive. David would stock up on supplies in late fall and then wait out the cold months alone in his cabin. He had plenty of firewood, preserved food, and books to read. But the silence during those long winter nights was sometimes overwhelming. He had thought about getting a dog for company, but something always stopped him. Maybe it was because Maria had wanted a dog and getting one now felt like moving on in a way he wasn't ready for. Or maybe he was afraid that even a dog might eventually leave him somehow. The hiking trails near his property sometimes brought visitors during summer months. Lost hikers would occasionally knock on his door asking for directions or help. David was always kind to them, offering water and pointing them back toward the main trail. Some would thank him and continue on their way. Others would chat for a few minutes, curious about his simple mountain life. These brief meetings with strangers were often the only conversations David had for weeks at a time. He was grateful for them, even if they were short. It reminded him that there was still a world beyond his mountain, full of people living their own stories. David's truck was old, but reliable. He had learned to fix it himself over the years because the nearest mechanic was in town, 2 hours away. The truck had seen better days, with rust spots and a dent in the back from when a tree branch fell on it during a storm. But it started every time he needed it, and that was what mattered. Money wasn't a big worry for David. Maria had had a small life insurance policy, and David had some savings from his old job in construction. He lived simply and didn't need much. The land was paid for and his needs were basic. Still, he sometimes sold vegetables at the farmer's market in town or did odd construction jobs for neighbors when they needed help. People in town respected David. They saw him as a man who had chosen a hard path after losing his wife but had found a way to keep going. Some admired his independence and self-sufficiency. Others worried that he was too isolated and tried to include him in community events. David appreciated both the respect and the concern, even if he rarely took people up on their invitations. His daily routine had become a comfort. Wake up, coffee, check the garden, work on projects, read, sleep. It was predictable and safe. David had found peace in this routine, even if it was sometimes lonely. He had learned that peace and happiness weren't always the same thing. But peace was something he could count on. On this particular morning, as David finished his coffee and prepared to start his daily walk around the property, he had no idea that his quiet, predictable life was about to change forever. The mountain mist was lifting, birds were starting to sing, and somewhere in the forest nearby, someone was in desperate need of the kindness that David had always carried in his heart. He put on his worn hiking boots, grabbed his walking stick, and headed out to check the fence line that marked his property boundary. It was a walk he had taken hundreds of times before, but today would be different. Today, David would discover that sometimes the most important moments in life come when you least expect them, hidden in the ordinary routine of an ordinary day. David had walked this path so many times he could probably do it with his eyes closed. The fence line ran along the eastern edge of his property, where his land met the national forest. It was a 30-minute walk through tall pine trees and over small streams. Usually the only sounds were birds singing and his boots crunching on pine needles. But this morning was different. About halfway along the fence, David heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was crying. Not the kind of crying from a hurt animal, but human crying. Someone was sobbing in the forest, and they sounded like they were in real trouble. David stood still for a moment, listening carefully. The crying was coming from deeper in the woods, off the main trail. It was definitely a woman, and she sounded scared and hurt. David's heart started beating faster. In all his years living on the mountain, he had never heard anything like this. He left the fence line and carefully made his way toward the sound. The forest was thick here, with fallen logs and thorny bushes that made walking difficult. David pushed through branches and stepped over rocks, following the sound of crying that seemed to get louder as he got closer. What he found made his stomach turn and his anger rise at the same time. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, was tied to a large pine tree. Thick rope was wrapped around her wrists, binding her hands behind her back around the tree trunk. Her clothes were dirty and torn, like she had been dragged through the forest. Her long brown hair was messy and had leaves stuck in it. But what broke David's heart the most were her eyes. They were red from crying and filled with a kind of fear and shame that no person should ever have to feel. When she saw David approaching, she tried to shrink back against the tree, even though she couldn't move much because of the ropes. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaky and weak. "Please don't hurt me anymore." David immediately stopped walking and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Hey, it's okay," he said in the gentlest voice he could manage. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help. My name is David and I live nearby." The woman looked at him with confusion and disbelief. She had obviously been through something terrible, and David could see that trust wasn't going to come easily. "Let me untie you," David said, slowly moving closer. "You're hurt and you need help." As David carefully worked to untie the knots, the woman began to speak through her tears. Her name was Lucy and her story was heartbreaking. "They said I was too fat," Lucy whispered, her voice breaking. "They said I was bringing shame to my family and that no man would ever want to marry someone like me. They said I was worthless." David's hands paused on the rope as anger filled his chest. Who could do something like this to another human being? "My own brothers brought me here," Lucy continued. "They said I was an embarrassment to the family name. They said that since no man would ever love me, I might as well disappear. They tied me up and left me here to die." The rope was tight and the knots were complicated, but David worked patiently to free her. As he worked, he could see bruises on Lucy's wrists where the rope had been cutting into her skin. "They're wrong," David said firmly as he worked on the last knot. "Whoever told you those things, they're wrong about you." Lucy looked up at him with surprise. She had clearly been expecting judgment or confirmation of what her family had told her. Instead, this stranger in the woods was telling her the opposite. When David finally got the ropes off, Lucy's hands were so numb she couldn't move them properly. David gently helped her stand up, but her legs were shaky from being tied up for so long. She would have fallen if David hadn't been there to steady her. "How long have you been here?" David asked. "Since yesterday morning," Lucy replied. I thought no one would ever find me. I thought they were right and that maybe it was better this way." David felt his heart break a little more. This woman had been convinced that she deserved to be abandoned in the forest. Someone had filled her mind with such horrible lies about her own worth that she had almost given up on living. "Lucy," David said, looking directly into her eyes, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not worthless. You are not an embarrassment. And you certainly don't deserve what happened to you." Lucy stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he was telling the truth or just being polite. "You're perfect as you are," David continued, "and anyone who can't see that is blind." For the first time since David had found her, Lucy stopped crying. She looked at this kind stranger who had found her in the woods and spoken to her with more kindness than her own family had shown her in years. "I don't understand," Lucy said quietly. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," David replied. "I know that you're a person who deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. I know that what happened to you was wrong. And I know that whoever convinced you that you were worthless was lying to you." David offered Lucy his arm for support. "My cabin isn't far from here. You need food, water, and medical attention for those rope burns. Will you let me help you?" Lucy hesitated. After being betrayed by her own family, trusting a stranger felt scary. But David had untied her when he could have just walked away. He had spoken to her with kindness when everyone else had shown her cruelty. And something in his eyes told her that this man meant what he said. "Okay," Lucy whispered. The walk back to David's cabin was slow. Lucy was weak from being tied up all night and day without food or water. David stayed close beside her, ready to catch her if she stumbled. He didn't push her to talk more about what had happened. Instead, he pointed out different trees and birds along the way, giving her something else to think about. When they reached the cabin, David helped Lucy sit down on his front porch while he went inside to get water and a first aid kit. Lucy looked around at the simple but well-kept property. There was the vegetable garden David had been tending, a small workshop, and a few outbuildings. Everything looked cared for and peaceful. It was so different from the chaos and judgment she had left behind. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lucy felt like she might be somewhere safe. David came back outside with supplies to clean her wounds and a large glass of water. As he gently cleaned the rope burns on her wrists, he continued to speak to her with the same kindness he had shown in the forest. "You're going to be okay," he told her. "Whatever happened before, that's over now. You're safe here." Lucy wanted to believe him, but years of being told she was worthless had made it hard for her to accept kindness. Still, as David carefully bandaged her wrists and offered her food, she began to think that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world was cruel. Maybe she had found someone who would see her as more than just her appearance. Maybe she had found someone who understood that a person's worth comes from who they are inside, not what they look like on the outside. For the first time in years, Lucy allowed herself to hope. David's cabin was small but comfortable. The main room had a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen, and a few pieces of handmade furniture. Lucy sat at the wooden dining table while David prepared a simple meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh vegetables from his garden. "I don't want to be any trouble," Lucy said quietly, watching David work in the kitchen. "You're not trouble," David replied, setting a plate in front of her. "When was the last time you ate?" Lucy had to think about it. Her family had given her bread and water the morning before they brought her to the forest, but she had been too upset to eat much. "Yesterday morning, I think," David frowned. No wonder she was so weak. He made sure she had plenty of food and kept refilling her water glass. As Lucy ate, some color started returning to her face. "I have a guest room," David said when she finished eating. "It's not fancy, but the bed is comfortable and there are clean clothes in the dresser. They belong to my wife." Lucy looked up at him with surprise. "Your wife?" "She passed away 5 years ago," David explained simply. "She was about your size, so the clothes should fit." David showed Lucy to the guest room. It was a small, cozy space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the mountain valley. The clothes in the dresser were simple but well made. Soft cotton shirts, warm sweaters, and sturdy jeans. "Take as much time as you need," David said. "There's a bathroom right across the hall. Take a hot shower, get some rest. We can talk more when you're feeling better." Lucy couldn't remember the last time someone had been so thoughtful without wanting something in return. She showered for the first time in days, washing the dirt and fear from her hair and skin. She put on clean clothes that actually fit her properly, unlike the tight, uncomfortable clothes her family had always insisted she wear to try to hide her body. When she looked in the bathroom mirror, Lucy barely recognized herself. Without the dirt and tears, without the tight clothes and the look of fear in her eyes, she looked like a completely different person. She looked like someone who might actually matter. Lucy slept for nearly 12 hours. When she woke up, afternoon sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window. She could hear David working somewhere outside, but he wasn't making much noise. Even his presence was gentle. She found him in the vegetable garden, carefully weeding around the tomato plants. When he saw her approaching, he smiled and stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much better, thank you," Lucy replied. "I can't remember the last time I slept that well." As they talked, Lucy found herself looking at David's garden with growing interest. The plants were healthy and well organized, but she could see a few things that could be improved. "You have beautiful tomatoes," she said, "but they might grow even better with some companion planting." David looked at her with surprise. "Companion planting?" "Planting certain things together that help each other grow," Lucy explained. "Like basil near tomatoes. It keeps bugs away and actually makes the tomatoes taste better." Lucy had learned about plants from her grandmother, who had taught her about gardening and herbal medicine before she passed away. It was one of the few skills Lucy had that her family didn't criticize, mainly because they didn't think it was important enough to notice. "I also noticed some chamomile growing wild near your fence," Lucy continued. "If you dry it properly, it makes excellent tea for helping people sleep better." David was fascinated. In all his years of gardening, he had focused mainly on growing enough food to eat. He had never thought about the relationships between different plants or their medicinal uses. "Would you show me?" he asked. Lucy smiled. It felt good to know something useful, to have skills that someone appreciated. "I'd love to." Over the next few days, Lucy began to feel stronger physically and emotionally. David never pressured her to talk about her past, but he was always ready to listen when she wanted to share. Gradually, Lucy told him more about her life. She had grown up in a small, traditional community about 4 hours away from David's mountain. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where being different was seen as shameful. Lucy's family had always been critical of her weight, even when she was a child. "My mother put me on my first diet when I was 8 years old," Lucy told David one evening as they sat on the front porch. "She said it was for my own good, that no one would ever love me if I didn't lose weight." David shook his head sadly. He couldn't imagine saying something so cruel to a child. "I tried everything," Lucy continued. "Every diet, every exercise program. Sometimes I would lose weight and my family would be happy with me for a while, but then I would gain it back and they would act like I had personally disappointed them." "What about friends?" David asked. "Surely someone saw your value." Lucy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "In my town, people don't want to be friends with the family embarrassment. I was known as the girl who couldn't control herself, the one who would never find a husband." As the days passed, David began to see how wrong Lucy's family had been about her. She was incredibly intelligent. With a vast knowledge of plants and natural remedies, she could identify every tree and flower on his property and explain their uses. She also had practical skills that amazed David. When his old radio stopped working, Lucy took it apart and fixed it in less than an hour. When a pipe under the kitchen sink started leaking, Lucy figured out the problem and repaired it before David even knew there was an issue. She seemed to have a natural ability to understand how things worked and fix them when they broke. "Where did you learn all this?" David asked after watching Lucy repair a broken fence post with ease. "My grandfather," Lucy said. "He was the only one in my family who didn't care what I looked like. He taught me about fixing things, about plants, about using my hands and my mind. He said that real worth comes from what you can do and how you treat people, not from what you look like." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," David said. "He was," Lucy replied sadly. "He died when I was 16. After that, there was no one left to stand up for me." David felt a surge of anger toward Lucy's family. How could they ignore all of her talents and focus only on her appearance? How could they waste the gift of having someone so skilled and intelligent in their lives? But David also felt something else growing in his heart. admiration for Lucy's strength, appreciation for her skills, and something warmer that he was just beginning to recognize. Lucy was transforming his simple mountain life in ways he hadn't expected. She had improved his garden, fixed things around the house that he had been putting off, and filled his quiet cabin with conversation and laughter. For the first time since Maria died, David looked forward to waking up each morning. One evening, as they worked together to preserve vegetables from the garden, Lucy looked up at David with tears in her eyes. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to me," she said. "My own family couldn't stand to have me around. Why would a stranger want to help me?" David set down the jar he was filling and looked at Lucy seriously. "Because you're worth helping," he said simply. "Because you're talented and intelligent and kind. Because you've made my life better just by being here." Lucy stared at him in amazement. No one had ever talked about her like that before. "Your family was wrong about you, Lucy," David continued. "Dead wrong, and I'm sorry they convinced you to believe their lies." For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Lucy cried tears of relief instead of sadness. Someone finally saw her for who she really was. Someone finally valued her mind, her skills, and her heart instead of judging her by her appearance. As summer turned toward fall, both David and Lucy began to realize that something special was growing between them. It wasn't just friendship or gratitude. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that neither of them had expected to find but both were beginning to hope might last. As the leaves on the mountain began turning brilliant shades of red and gold, David found himself looking forward to each new day in a way he hadn't felt since before Maria died. Lucy had been living in his guest room for nearly 2 months now, and the cabin felt more alive than it had in years. Every morning, David would wake to the smell of fresh coffee and often find Lucy already working in the garden or the kitchen. She had a natural rhythm for mountain life, rising early and making the most of each day. But more than that, she brought an energy and warmth that filled the spaces David hadn't even realized had been empty. "The mint is ready to harvest," Lucy announced one morning, coming into the kitchen with her hands full of fragrant green leaves. "If we dry it properly, we'll have enough tea to last through winter." David watched her work, noting how her movements had become confident and purposeful. The scared, broken woman he had found tied to a tree was disappearing, replaced by someone who was discovering her own strength and worth. "You know," David said, sipping his coffee, "I lived on this mountain for years thinking I was doing pretty well for myself. Turns out I didn't know the first thing about really using the land." Lucy looked up from sorting mint leaves with a smile. "You knew enough to keep yourself fed and healthy. That's not nothing. But you've shown me how much more is possible," David replied. "The herbal medicine garden you planted, the way you've organized the root cellar, even the way you've taught me to read the weather by watching the plants. I feel like I'm finally living here instead of just surviving." Over the past weeks, Lucy had transformed not just David's property, but his entire way of thinking about the mountain. She had identified dozens of edible and medicinal plants growing wild on his land that he had never noticed. She had shown him how to preserve food in ways that kept more of the nutrition and flavor. She had even taught him to make natural remedies for common problems like headaches and muscle soreness. But the changes went deeper than practical skills. Lucy brought conversation and laughter to David's quiet evenings. She was curious about everything, asking thoughtful questions about his life before the mountain, his memories of Maria, and his dreams for the future. She listened to his stories with genuine interest and shared her own experiences without the shame her family had taught her to feel. "Tell me about your grandfather again," David said one evening as they sat by the fireplace, working on their respective projects. David was carving a new handle for a garden tool while Lucy mended a tear in one of his old shirts. Lucy smiled, the way she always did when talking about her grandfather. "He was the kindest man I ever knew. He had these huge, gentle hands that could fix anything. He never raised his voice, never said a mean word about anyone. He sounds like he would have been proud of the woman you've become," David said, glancing up from his carving. Lucy paused in her sewing. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," David replied firmly. "Look at everything you've accomplished, everything you know how to do. Look at how you've taken care of yourself and adapted to a completely new life. Your grandfather would be amazed." These conversations had become precious to both of them. David found himself sharing memories and thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Lucy discovered that her opinions and ideas mattered to someone, that her voice was worth hearing. One afternoon, while they were working together to winterize the garden, Lucy straightened up and looked around at the mountain landscape with the expression of pure contentment. "I love it here," she said simply. David felt his heart skip a beat. "Really?" "Really," Lucy confirmed. "I love the quiet mornings and the way the mist looks in the valley. I love working with my hands and seeing the results. I love knowing that everything I need is right here, that I don't have to depend on people who don't value me." She paused and looked directly at David. "And I love having someone to share it with who actually wants me here." David set down his gardening tools and turned to face her completely. "Lucy, I need to tell you something." She looked at him with curiosity and perhaps a little nervousness. "When I found you in those woods, I thought I was just helping someone in trouble," David said. I never imagined that you would change my whole life." Lucy's breathing became a little faster, but she didn't look away. "You've brought joy back into my world," David continued. "You've shown me parts of myself I didn't know existed. You've made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow." "David," Lucy whispered, but he held up his hand gently. "I know you've been hurt by people who were supposed to love you," he said. "I know you have every reason to be careful about trusting someone with your heart, but I need you to know that I care about you, not because I feel sorry for you, not because I think you need saving, but because you're an amazing woman who has made my life infinitely better." Lucy felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of sadness. "I care about you too," she said quietly, "more than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone." David stepped closer to her. "I love your curiosity about everything around you. I love watching you work in the garden, the way you get completely absorbed in what you're doing. I love how you can fix anything that breaks and how you always think of solutions I never would have considered." "I love your kindness," Lucy replied, her voice growing stronger. "I love how safe you make me feel, how you never make me think I have to be anyone other than who I am. I love your patience and the way you really listen when I talk." They stood there in the garden, surrounded by the plants they had tended together, finally admitting what had been growing between them for weeks. "Lucy," David said gently, "would it be all right if I kissed you?" Instead of answering with words, Lucy stepped closer and reached up to touch his face. When their lips met, it was soft and warm and full of all the feelings they had been too afraid to speak. When they broke apart, Lucy laughed with pure happiness. "I never thought I would feel like this," she said. "I never thought anyone would want to kiss me or hold me or love me." "Then you've been surrounded by fools," David said, pulling her close again. "Because you are absolutely worth loving." As autumn deepened into winter, David and Lucy settled into a new rhythm as a couple. They cooked meals together, worked on projects side by side, and spent long evenings talking about their hopes and dreams. The physical affection between them grew naturally from their emotional connection, each touch and kiss expressing the deep respect and care they felt for each other. Lucy bloomed under David's love and acceptance. She stood taller, smiled more freely, and spoke with confidence about her ideas and opinions. The shame her family had forced her to carry began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of her own worth. David, too, was transformed by love. The quiet sadness that had surrounded him since Maria's death began to lift. He found himself laughing more, taking pleasure in small moments, and looking forward to the future with excitement rather than just resignation. One snowy evening in December, as they sat together by the fire, Lucy looked up from the book she was reading. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think Maria would have liked me?" David considered the question seriously. "I think Maria would have loved you," he said finally. "She always said that the most beautiful people were the ones who used their talents to make the world better. You do that every day." Lucy smiled and snuggled closer to David on the couch. Outside, snow was falling softly over the mountain, but inside the cabin everything was warm and peaceful and full of love. Neither of them knew what the future would bring, but they knew they wanted to face it together. They had found something precious in each other, something that neither distance nor cruelty nor fear could take away. They had found real love, the kind that sees and values the whole person, the kind that grows stronger with time and understanding, and they had found it in the most unexpected place. growing quietly in the peace of the mountains, nurtured by kindness and watered with hope. Winter on the mountain was usually David's hardest time, but this year felt completely different. Instead of facing months of isolation, he woke each morning to Lucy's warm presence beside him. They had moved from friendship to love so naturally that sharing a bed felt like the most natural thing in the world. The snow was deeper than usual this year, making the road to town completely impassable for weeks at a time. But David and Lucy found they didn't mind being snowed in together. They had plenty of preserved food, a warm cabin, and each other's company. "I used to dread winter," David told Lucy one morning as they watched fresh snow falling outside the kitchen window. "The silence used to feel so heavy, like it was pressing down on me." "And now?" Lucy asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Now it feels peaceful instead of empty," David replied, leaning back against her. "Like we're in our own little world where nothing can hurt us." Lucy had never experienced winter in the mountains before, and she found she loved it. She loved the way the snow transformed the landscape into something magical, the way the bare trees looked like intricate drawings against the sky, and the way the cold made their warm cabin feel like the coziest place on earth. During the long winter evenings, they planned improvements for the coming spring. Lucy had ideas for expanding the medicinal herb garden, and maybe even starting a small greenhouse. David wanted to build an addition to the workshop where Lucy could have space for her various projects. "What if we started selling some of your herbal remedies?" David suggested one night. "People in town are always looking for natural alternatives to expensive medicines." Lucy looked up from the journal where she was recording recipes for teas and ointments. "Do you think people would be interested?" "I know they would," David said confidently. "Mrs. Patterson at the general store is always complaining about her arthritis. And young Mike at the hardware store mentioned that his wife has trouble sleeping since the baby was born. You have solutions for problems like that." The idea excited Lucy. She had always known her knowledge was valuable, but her family had dismissed it as worthless, old-fashioned nonsense. The thought of actually helping people and earning money with her skills felt empowering. As winter began to give way to spring, David knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Lucy. He had thought about proposing for weeks, but he wanted to do it right. Not with a fancy ring or elaborate gestures, but in a way that honored who Lucy was and what their love meant. One warm morning in early March, when the snow was melting and the first spring flowers were beginning to bloom, David asked Lucy to take a walk with him to their favorite spot on the property. It was a small clearing that looked out over the valley, where they often went to watch the sunrise or sunset. "Lucy," David said when they reached the clearing, "I want to ask you something important." Lucy turned to face him, her heart beginning to beat faster. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life," David continued. "You've shown me what it means to truly share a life with someone, to build something together that's bigger than what either of us could create alone." He took her hands in his. "I know marriage might seem scary after the way your family treated you. I know you might worry about people judging us or trying to interfere with what we have here." Lucy felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but they were happy tears. "But I want the whole world to know that I choose you," David said. "I want to promise in front of anyone who will listen that I will love you and value you and stand by you for the rest of my life." "David," Lucy whispered, "will you marry me, Lucy? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are the most precious thing in my world?" Lucy threw her arms around David's neck and kissed him with all the joy and love in her heart. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Yes, yes, yes." They planned a simple wedding for late spring when the mountain would be at its most beautiful. They invited a few neighbors who had become friends, the pastor from the small church in town and Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who had become one of Lucy's first customers for herbal teas. Lucy didn't have any family she wanted to invite. The people who had abandoned her in the forest had shown their true nature, and she had no desire to include them in this celebration of love and new beginnings. Instead, the guest list was filled with people who had come to know and appreciate Lucy for who she really was. The retired couple who lived on the next mountain over and often traded vegetables with David. The young family whose car had broken down near David's property the previous summer, whom Lucy had helped with natural remedies for their sick child. The park ranger who had become a friend after Lucy had helped him identify some rare medicinal plants in the area. These people saw Lucy as David saw her, intelligent, capable, kind, and valuable exactly as she was. The wedding took place in the clearing where David had proposed, decorated with wildflowers that Lucy had cultivated around the property. Lucy wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, fitted to her body in a way that made her feel beautiful and comfortable. David wore his best shirt and the new vest that Lucy had made for him as a wedding gift. The ceremony was short and heartfelt. When the pastor asked David to share his vows, he spoke from the heart. "Lucy, when I found you in those woods, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me. You brought light back into my world and showed me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit perfectly with your own." When it was Lucy's turn, she surprised everyone, including herself, with the strength and confidence in her voice. "David, you were the first person to see me for who I really am, instead of who others thought I should be. You taught me that my worth doesn't come from other people's approval, but from the love I give and receive and the good I do in the world. I promise to love you not just with my heart, but with my hands and my mind and my whole life." After they exchanged simple gold bands that David had ordered from town, the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. Their guests cheered and threw flower petals as David and Lucy kissed, officially beginning their life together. The reception was held on David's front porch, with food that Lucy had prepared using vegetables from their garden and herbs she had gathered and preserved. Their guests told stories about how the couple had helped them or brightened their lives in some way. Mrs. Patterson stood up to make a toast. "I've known David for years, and I've never seen him as happy as he's been since Lucy came into his life. And Lucy, honey, you've got a gift that this community has been lucky to discover. Here's to two people who make each other better and make all of us better too." As evening fell and their guests began to head home, David and Lucy sat together on their porch swing, still wearing their wedding clothes, watching the stars come out over the mountain. "Do you ever think about your family?" David asked gently. "Do you wonder what they would think if they could see you now?" Lucy considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with sadness anymore. I think about how wrong they were, how they missed out on knowing the real me. Their loss, not mine." She leaned against David's shoulder. "I have a real family now. I have you, and I have friends who value me. I have a home where I belong and work that matters. That's more than they ever gave me." Over the following months, David and Lucy's life together continued to flourish. Lucy's herbal remedy business grew by word of mouth, and soon people were driving up the mountain specifically to buy her teas, salves, and tinctures. She also started teaching classes on plant identification and natural medicine, sharing her knowledge with others who were interested in learning. David expanded his woodworking to create beautiful containers for Lucy's products and built the greenhouse they had planned during the winter. Together, they created a small but thriving business that allowed them to live comfortably while staying true to their values of simple, sustainable living. 1 year after their wedding, as they sat in the same clearing where David had proposed, Lucy made an announcement that filled them both with joy. "I'm pregnant," she said, placing David's hand on her still flat stomach. David's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Really?" "Really," Lucy confirmed. "Our baby will grow up here, surrounded by love and nature and the knowledge that they are valuable exactly as they are." As they held each other in the mountain clearing, watching the sun set over the valley they now called home, both David and Lucy knew they had found something rare and precious. They had found a love that saw past appearances to the beauty within. They had found a partnership that made them both stronger and better. They had found a place where they belonged exactly as they were. The cruel voices that had once convinced Lucy she was worthless had been replaced by David's daily affirmations of her value. The loneliness that had haunted David's mountain had been filled with Lucy's laughter and love. Together they had built a life that was richer and more beautiful than either of them had ever imagined possible. Their story was proof that real love doesn't see flaws, it sees the whole person and chooses to cherish every part. It was proof that worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, but by the love we give and receive and the good we do in the world.